just wanted to welcome everyone to another Women's Soaring project event honoring and celebrating Women's History Month with the generous financial support of the Mira Costa College Foundation and the endorsements of Sierra College's Gender Equity Committee, Mira Costa College's Diversity, Equity, and Cultural Competence Committee, as well as Mira Costa College's Social Justice and Equity Center. Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge and give respect to the Indigenous community and land on which our colleges stand. We would like to start with Sierra College's land acknowledgement. With respect, we acknowledge the Rockland campus of Sierra College as the traditional and unceded land of the Nisenan and Miwok peoples. The secret ravine known as Nisenan as Hoyok is home to an ancestral village site protected for generations by local tribal nations and their members. Sierra College commits to an ongoing relationship with the United Auburn Indian community and other local tribes, and to respect the legacy of the first peoples of this land and their future generations, who are an integral part of the Sierra College community.
And now for Mira Costa College's land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the Payam Kowichim, the people of the West, as the traditional land caretakers of the land on which Mira Costa College is built and its surrounding traditional cultural landscapes. Today, the Payam Kowichim are known as Luiseno and are made up of 7 bands: La Jolla, Palma, Pachanga, Rincon, San Luis Rey, and Saboba. We, the Mira Costa College and community, acknowledge that we are visitors on Indigenous lands and pay our respects to the Luiseno, past, present, and emerging. We are grateful to have the opportunity to be part of this community in the Luiseno territory and to honor their history, culture, and perseverance of spirit.
We would also like to take the time to acknowledge the national holiday today in honor of the late Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez Day is celebrated on March 31st of every year in recognition of his birthday. Chavez was born on March 31st, 1927 in Yuma, Arizona, and later became one of the most well-known civil rights activists fighting for the rights of farm workers in the Latinx community here in the United States. He co-founded the National Farm Workers Association, now known as the United Farm Workers. One of Chavez's most simple yet powerful quotes was, "The fight is never about grapes or lettuce. It is always about people." The same sentiment can be applied in the fight against racism. That is, it is always about people.
Again, we'd like to welcome you all to a special Women's Soaring Projects online event featuring a conversation with the creators of the award-winning podcast, Dear White Women, and their newly published book, Dear White Women, Let's Get Uncomfortable Talking About Racism. I'm Jackie Lowe, an instructor at Mira Costa College and Southwestern College, and I'm also the co-founder of Women's Soaring Project, and with Dr. Jane Lee Scaife. Jane and I are best friends and educators who created WSP as a resource to learn and be inspired by incredible women in history. We would like to give special thanks to Megan Seeley, who is a professor of sociology and social justice at Sierra College and author of Fight Like a Girl, How to Be a Fearless Feminist, published by NYU Press. Megan is helping us moderate the event today, so thank you, Megan.
Hi, everyone. Now I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Jane Lee Scaife. I teach sociology at Sierra College and UC Davis. And like Jackie has already mentioned, I co-founded the Women's Soaring Project with her as a way to honor and celebrate women who have often been ignored and overlooked in history. Each year, we select a theme under which we highlight the achievements of historical women. This year's theme is focusing on women anti-racist, and we are very fortunate to offer the powerful anti-racist voices of Sarah Blanchard and Misasha Suzuki Graham with us today at this WSP online event.
Sorry, let me flip the slide. Similar to Jane and me, Sara and Misasha met 25 years ago during college. It was at a Harvard discussion where they began the difficult dialogue about race and racism as mixed race individuals themselves. The two biracial best friends continued their conversation over the next 2 decades and eventually created their award-winning Dear White Women podcast in 2019, and more recently published their first book together in 2021 with the same name. The book is unique in illustrating the intersection of race, gender, and parenthood, while calling for more white people and white women in particular into action in the ongoing fight against racism. Misasha, the lawyer, brings perspective on history and current events, along with her family's Black experience. And Sara, the life coach, brings positive psychology and humanity to the table, along with her white presenting family's experience.
In order to provide some context and perspective on their anti-racist efforts, we have decided to invite Sara and Misasha to read their individual autobiographical sections of their book. So, Misasha, if you don't mind starting and reading your section.
Sure. So thank you so much to Jackie, Jane, and Megan, and your entire community for having us here today. I am really honored to be able to read a portion of this autobiographical section because it is so personal to me. So thank you in advance for listening. So the need to figure out where I fit in and the desire to bridge cultures and communities have been central to my existence from my very earliest memories. If you've ever been to a rest stop somewhere in the United States and desperately looked for your name in those racks of little keychain nameplates, only to never find it, I think you might understand. It is probably the sense of trying to fit in, or my acute consciousness of being biracial, that led me to spend as much time in Japan as possible, including working there after college graduation and again during law school summers. It is probably that same sense that led me to the practice of law and which propelled my specific desire to balance intellectual property litigation with pro bono aid for people who are struggling to be heard in our justice system. It is definitely my experience with fighting and struggling to fit in and be heard that led me to this point with Sara, first starting our podcast, Dear White Women, and now writing this book together. Because in so doing, I am literally fighting to save my children's lives. For those of you who think I might be being dramatic, I understand. I may have thought so myself many years ago before I married my husband, who is Black, and had my 2 sons who are multiracial but seen by the world as Black. There have been many points in my life where I benefited from white privilege, even though I'm only half white. There have been exactly 0 times when my husband has benefited from those privileges. He and my sons live under a constant reminder that, as Black men in America, they are considered less than. I was pregnant with my first son when Trayvon Martin was shot and killed in the street by an armed so-called vigilante. He was 17 years old. I was holding my second son in my arms, a tiny infant, when Tamir Rice was gunned down at the age of 12 for holding a cap gun. When you have Black children, every story that you hear of a Black person being killed is one that you add to your mental catalog of, this is how my child might be killed. When George Floyd was being murdered in the street and called out for his mama, I heard my kids calling my name. This thought breaks my heart in ways that I cannot physically write or describe. But in that same instant that my heart is breaking, it also gives me the strength to fight, because as a mother, you will fight to save your children. You will do anything. This book is part of my anything. Another thought that breaks my heart is imagining being a Black mother who has to carry a mental death catalog like this while also trying to figure out how to navigate her way through a world that is stacked against her own survival. Having conversations with Sara and with other close friends and family has reinforced for me that a mother's fears for her children and her family are the closest to her head and heart. However, I found that once one starts thinking more broadly about the fears and hopes of those who may have different narratives and different experiences in the very same place where you live or work or love, it's hard to stop. But I get it. I understand why that kind of perspective is often in short supply, why the dialogue stalls. Those conversations are hard to start, especially if in your circle of friends or in your family, everyone is the same race. When would you even have the opportunity to engage in discussions about the hopes and fears bound up in issues of race? That's why I'm here to tell you this, which may provide you a little bit of food for thought. This past summer, I took my sons to a peaceful Black Lives Matter rally. We made posters before the event. My elementary school-aged son, after writing Black Lives Matter on his poster, then wrote, in smaller letters underneath, "My life matters." So to return to this central question, why do I do this work? Because I want us to get to a place where no kid feels the need to justify his life to a group of people who may want to take that away from him simply because of the color of his skin. I know we are capable of doing hard things. I'm asking for your help to save my children's lives and the lives of all others who look like them. We can do this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Misasha. It still tugs at my heartstrings, even though it's the second time I've heard that. So, Sara, if you don't mind just doing your book reading to kind of provide some context for the audience as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, okay, I'm glad someone said applause because I was actually going to be like, yay. I both love and hate when you read that, because every time we do conversations around that, I am holding back my tears, right? And I've heard this, and I love you and I love your family. And if it's hard for me to hold back my tears, I can only imagine what it must do to you to share these stories over and over for everybody else's sake. So thank you for doing that reading, Misasha. Okay, a little bit about me. So I'll read this section. I resided for years in Japan and Hong Kong and New York, places with long histories that are open to many different ways to live. You know, I've sponsored music groups that address racial and gender identity on tours through school districts, organized conversations with mixed race company in my home, created panel discussions for predominantly white communities to listen to the experiences of their Black members, worked on video projects showcasing voices of Black people in America. And obviously, Misasha and I have co-founded and co-host our podcast and this book. But the reality is none of these things make me, air quote, woke. None of them make me not racist. I especially protest the line of reasoning that if you are a non-Black person who has Black friends, it means you are not a racist. Why? Because I think racism is largely baked into our society. If we're really honest, we have to admit that we still often have knee-jerk reactions when we see people who look different than us. It is human. We're attracted to similarity. We feel that people who are similar to us are actually better than those who are different. And to support this, we have an elementary school red shirt, blue shirt experiment that we talk about later on in the book. But you know, that's on the personal level. That's not even talking about the structural biases that are perpetuated in many public and private institutions in our country. And this is why I'm qualified to be here in conversation with you, because I largely identify as white. And we can come back to that with an asterisk in conversation later. But after spending the first half of my life in metropolitan, cosmopolitan areas, including living abroad, I've now spent nearly 15 years living in predominantly white areas with my white husband and white presenting children. My Asian identity is still a core part of my values, but my Japanese flag waving has largely faded. Misasha has even caught me referring to us when I talk about white people. Any of us can hold up highlight reel stories about how amazingly open-minded we are, but there's always more to do, more to think about, room to grow, ways to make our personal world more diverse, inclusive, and beautiful. The biggest thing I want to say is that I'm here with you, not to judge you. I don't believe that there is such a thing as arriving at woke. Work in this realm is a continuum, a spectrum, a progression, a direction we're moving in towards being more anti-racist. I have been working on myself and my community now for years. Why has this taken on more urgency as I've gotten older? It's astonishingly simple. Because I'm largely spurred on by the stories you just heard from Misasha, my best friend, mainly about how her fears about her kids being killed based solely on the color of their skin were so drastically different than my fears for my lighter skinned kids. Honestly, I've always cared about anti-racism, but not enough to do something about it until it became personal. I hope we can help you find a personal connection to it too. So.
Thank you so much to the both of you for sharing your incredible perspectives and experiences. And again, I echo Sarah's comments about just Misasha, your experience with your family and your kids. And I know that it can be quite emotional no matter how many times you read the same paragraph. So thank you so much to the both of you. So thank you again for the wonderful reading from the book. And at this time, I think we are going to just move to the conversation with Sara and Misasha, and Jackie and I have come up with some questions, and we'll be sure to leave some time at the end of this event for the Q&A from the audience. And thank you to everybody for showing up and being involved. And I see a lot of interaction going on in the chat in appreciation for you to Sara and Misasha. So I encourage you to read all the little emojis and words from the audience. So we'll go ahead and start with taking a step back in time in terms of your anti-racist journey together. So what led you to creating Dear White Woman podcast together? And was there a specific event or influence that might have sparked that particular endeavor?
Misasha, are you going to take this, or do you want me to start?
I feel like you always tee it up so well at the start.
Okay.
So.
I mean, you heard our story, right? You heard that we met 25 years ago walking out of a racial identity conversation when we were undergrads, and that we're biracial. So like this idea of identity, who, what box do people want to peg us into? Grappling with that has always been part of who we are as individuals. But over the arc of our friendship, as our conversations shifted from what you have in your 20s all the way to what we started having when we had kids, we realized that, as we talk about your hopes and your dreams and your fears for your children, our fears both were different, but also were very much not reflected in the circles that we were able to float in. I think, Misasha, if you want to take it from here.
Yeah, I think by virtue of who we are, we have been privy to a lot of circles full of white people over the years. And I think because of that, we have a sort of a deep understanding of what's said in those circles, what's not said in those circles. And this third part, which is what's said in those circles when people believe that there are no people of color around. And that third part is often the quiet part that never gets said out loud. And so once, especially, as I was talking about when I was reading the introduction, one of my biggest fears is that my boys will walk out of our house and not come back someday, solely based on the color of their skin. And my older son is 9 now, and he's at that point where he's no longer cute, or he's getting to be no longer cute, classified as cute, right? And for Black boys, that goes straight to aggressive, right? There is no middle ground. And those fears were not those that we heard in our circles for other parents with their kids. And so we thought, what if we could expand the narrative that we hear in those circles, right? To include more of what we knew to be true about all of our communities, not just certain portions of our communities. And what if we could really tap into, in particular, the power that women hold throughout so many spheres of life, right? Throughout at home, at work, in the PTA, at book clubs. I mean, you name it, women hold a lot of power, including wallet power, right? We make a lot of financial choices for our families and ourselves. So what if we could harness all of that and really use that to make change and make the change that we want to create the world that we want our kids to live in? Because do I want my kids to have the same fears about their kids? Absolutely not. Like, are they probably going to have those same fears? Probably. But what about their kids' right? Like, how do we make this change? So I think that's why we loved speaking, obviously, and writing. So, having the podcast and then writing the book are just continuing this path that we have to try and get this message out there, right? What is that? What is the world we want to see, and how do we practically get there? But what do we need to know about our history and who else is in our communities to make that change happen?
And I really appreciate, I think that I actually I have a lot of empathy for the both of you in terms of that shared experience, that it was my kids that really kind of created that fervor in me in terms of trying to protect them as a parent. And that's what I find value in your book, because Kimberly Crenshaw in the past has talked about the importance of intersectionality, but I think your book is so key. We talk about race and gender intersecting, but what about race, gender, and parenthood? And that's the value that I see in your book. So I guess I would ask, why is it so important to have that intersection in terms of your book in particular, the race, gender, and parenthood?
I mean, I think even just in practice, if you think that sometimes people show up to any conversation forgetting that our identities have shaped our lens through which we see everything, right? I think we're, as human beings, you sort of grow up thinking like kids do, right? Like, this is just the reality of the world that I grew up in. If you grew up living with two parents, that's your world. If, you know, people are like, what would your life be like if you didn't have a Japanese immigrant mom? I'm like, I literally have no idea, because that is the only life I grew up with. And so I think the more we practice being comfortable owning our identity in all its forms, through race, through gender, through, you know, and the more we can talk and teach our kids, who, by the way, I mean, I have a teenager now, and their fluency and comfort in discussing all of these topics blows me away. They are so open to new pronouns, to understanding race and how people show up differently. And so I almost feel like we need to do this to keep up with this next generation of children that are coming up so comfortable owning that, you know what, we are who we are. All of our experiences and our identities shape us. And the more we recognize this is mine, and not everybody is in this box, you know, not everybody has a smartphone to go to the restaurant to scan the QR code. People have so many different experiences, from little things like that all the way to how they show up wearing certain clothes or hairstyles or gender identities. I mean, I feel like this is just, it's important for us to remember that it is not just as simple as one conversation. These systems are all interrelated.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I remember in your, oh, sorry, Misasha,
No, go ahead.
chime in. Oh, I just remember in your book, you were talking about how difficult, you know, maybe in our generation, you know, using those words and not being clear on how to describe a person without pointing out their race in an awkward manner, or, you know, making sure that they're not, where is it relevant to the story? You know, do you need to point it out or not? And, but also, you know, I was wondering with your, you know, as parents, you know, how do you talk to the, you know, kids about race at a young age? Some parents don't want to. They want to shelter their children from the issue of race because they'll have, you know, at some point to deal with it for the rest of their lives. And what do you think about, parents talking about early on versus, you know, waiting to have that conversation with them?
Go. You know, I would pull out my sheet.
I know you would, but I think that, you know, in the book, we talk a lot about how early it is that kids see color and notice race. And it's really early. It's earlier than you would think. It's early as 6 months, you know, they're starting to differentiate between who their caregiver is and who are others, right? And, you know, I think in a lot of households, and I have heard I have had parents tell me that they don't want to talk about race, especially with their white children, because they're afraid it's going to traumatize them. And then I take a deep breath, because in our house, right, talking about race is something we do daily because it's about survival. And so I think that for a long time, we have had this concept that talking about race is something we don't do as a society, right? If you think about your earliest memories of mentioning someone else's race or skin color, and how that reaction was, like the adult reaction to that when you said that, was it to be like, shh, we don't talk about that, you know, or we don't see color or something, which is actually doing a huge disservice to my kids and every other kid who's been taught to be very proud of their color and who they are, right? And I think that for a long time, we in this country have not, and Sarah and I talk about this a lot, we have not talked about being white as a race, right? And so how we all really need to be in this conversation, because we all have a race. We all see color. And I think to deny that and to tell kids otherwise, we're not preparing them, right? It's kind of like, and that's not to say you need to tell kids everything, right? All at the start. There are very age appropriate ways to do this. But for example, I have a second grader. He has a country of origin project coming up. And in that country of origin project, they say like, okay, identify the countries that your family's from. And this is a problem for our family because my husband's family comes from Africa, right? But we don't have a record of that, what countries he comes from, because of slavery. So we have talked to the teacher, and we're going to say this. My son is going to say this in class because this is part of his history, right? His country, and his heritage. And his class, to their credit, have been, talking about racial literacy and talking about slavery in a way that's appropriate for second graders. And I've read in their class a kid's book about systemic racism, and they got it. Not only did they get it, they asked really great questions about it. And I think that's the greatest part about kids, right? They have a deep sense of what is fair and what is just, and they want to do those things, and they want to know about it. And I think they know when you're not being truthful on that front. So, gosh, there's just so much there that I feel like whenever parents get really concerned about it, or it's their fears coming through, right? Their kids really do want to have these conversations.
And I think the other part, oh, sorry. Is that okay?
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah, the other part that I want to emphasize is, or that I hear a lot is, when white parents are first coming to the table to understand, how do we talk to our kids about race? You do start when they're little talking about, now you have the skin color crayons and the whole palette, right? And then you can say everybody has a shade of brown is basically how we all show up, right? We're all in some tan spectrum around the world. And I think when white parents are hearing that, they're like, well, what's the point of talking to my kids about it? Because they're surrounded by white kids. But I think it's not just learning about sort of what's happening to others out there. If you want your kids to ever grow up and interact with anybody who looks different than them, like, you want your kids to understand about society's pressures so they can be good friends to their friend, right? You hear a lot about the parents having the talk, Black parents having the talk with their kids about if a cop pulls you over when you're driving, you don't want your child to be the one egging them all on so that they wind up getting hurt in the car, right? Like, you want your child to have safe friends and have their friends feel secure and healthy. And so it's not just about like, let's do it for other people. It's about the ability for your child to understand that people go through different experiences in life. And so we need to honor what helps keep everybody well.
One of the things that you bring up in your book that was so powerful to me is making the distinction between teaching your kids that, oh, we treat Black people nice, versus actually inviting Black friends over to the house. So can you expand more on that key point that I found so powerful, and just telling the audience what the difference is?
I mean, we talk a lot about the need for real community and relationships, right? And so I think a lot of times parents can assume kids are absorbing through osmosis these messages about what they think about others. But I think that's just it. Kids do see that. What you're normalizing in your home is what they see. So if, for example, you think you're being nice to the Black person you interact with on the street because you smiled at them, and you think that your kids now believe that we don't treat Black people any differently, but that all the people in your home who are invited over for dinner are your same race. The TV shows that you watch are those of the same race. Same thing for movies, right? Like, then you're not actually modeling the kind of relationships and respect, the real life interactions that kids do learn through osmosis, that this is how we show up in the world, that it's okay to have friends of different colors or, and beyond. So, does that make sense? Like, I think if people, like, if you think for a second, even about what you watch on TV and what we all have opportunities to watch on TV, when's the last time somebody watched Black-ish? or, you know, turned on Black Panther. I mean, it's an amazing movie, so maybe you do watch Black Panther all the time, but like shows that feature, or what did you think when you watched Turning Red and it was a character full of, or, you know, a cast of characters full of Asian people? You know, is that stuff that you do all the time, or maybe do you have TV shows that are really defaulting to what media is currently pushing out to us, which has been largely white people?
Monolithic. Yeah. No, and
I love
this
that
is
movie, by the way.
no, and just kind of, this is kind of off the questions just because of this conversation. You actually got me to thinking about just mass media and what is portrayed, and it's usually a monolithic image that we see in popular media. And I was actually at this age, very late in the game, recognizing why suddenly I had a revelation that I had such an affinity towards Native American. Like I did a whole senior thesis in high school on Native Americans. I just had an appreciation for it. And I just had this revelation that it was because I didn't see myself in any of the history books that I was reading in school. So the closest thing that looked like me was the Native Americans that were talked about in terms of the US history. So it was quite enlightening. And then this need to have much more diverse images in mass media is definitely an important point because we are consumers of that. Everyone nowadays is. Jackie, I don't know if you want to ask any other the questions. I think that we should definitely ask the second question that we had on our list because I feel like it's a really key point.
Yes. So this question was if you can explain the difference between being a non-racist and an anti-racist and why it's especially important for us today as a society to pursue anti-racism on a daily basis.
Okay, I feel like Sarah's staring at me through the screen.
You do that. You listened to this
Okay.
presentation, so you can absorb it and share it back.
So Dr. Beverly Tatum has a great visual example of this, and it's called a moving walkway, basically. So, you know, a moving walkway like the kind at airports and stuff like that. Everyone's on this walkway because this is society, and it's moving in the direction that society has always moved throughout time based on systemic racism, which is towards racism, right? So what you do on that walkway is going, what I'm going to talk about is basically highlighting or illustrating the difference between being non-racist and being an anti-racist, and it has to do with action. So if you're a racist, an active racist, you're on that walkway, you're walking, you're in that direction that society's moving, right? You were taking steps to, you know, you've got tiki torches in Charlottesville, like you are out there, front lines of racism, very vocally. If you're standing on that walkway, but you're facing in the direction that it's going, you might not be out there in the streets being very being very vocally racist, but you are still believing those thoughts. Maybe you're not saying them out loud in public places, but your actions on that front quietly are racist. All right, so let's say now you're on that walkway, you're not walking, and you're turned in the direction that the walkway isn't going, right? So you're facing the opposite direction. This is what being a non-racist is, right? This is what, when you say I'm not racist, so you are looking in the direction like of anti-racism, right? But you're not doing anything about that. This is kind of akin to saying like, well, I believe all people are created equal, but you're not doing anything in your life to promote that, right? But you hold these beliefs inside, but there's no action being taken. And I think that's the key step, because if you're an anti-racist on this walkway, you're actively walking in the direction that the walkway is not moving, right? You're walking in the direction of anti-racism. So that is related to action. So you're out there working in whatever sphere that you have influence in to be more anti-racist, right? And it is a journey, right? I like the walkway because it's a journey. You're not like getting to that end of that walkway because we can't see that end. But I think that for me, and I'm a visual person in that way, really highlights the action component of being an anti-racist.
I love that analogy, by the way, when I read it in the book. And I had a follow-up question. Jackie and I were debating whether or not we should ask this question in terms of that analogy, just because it is so visual. I'm just wondering if there's any way that we can actually go into that escalator and engineer it a different way and make it go in the opposite direction. And do you see that as being a feasible option for the future and what that might actually take?
I mean, that would be a fantastic dream, right? But as I've been told, the problem that I have seen, this is totally more anecdotal, not factually, but I think you'll understand, like, those people who are moving in the direction of racism, actively taking steps in that direction, tend to be really loud, right? If you look out and you see these rallies, hate feels like it's very loud, and I'm hearing that. Are we just as loud? And then you have the two groups in between that are getting pulled in that direction but are silent. So this whole silence is still moving in the direction of racism. Is the anti-racist voice in this country loud enough to offset all three of those groups right now? What can we do to get more people who are just quietly sitting in the middle, drifting in that direction, to join and actively make change? If we get mass numbers, yeah, maybe, but it's going to take a total rewriting of, like, this is where I'm saying, like, revolution is what we're talking about, right? Because the systems that have created our country are the foundations of where we're at. So to change, to overhaul that moving walkway is going to take a major shift, I think.
Yeah, I think that involves taking all the structures that we know in society that support racism systemically, which is pretty much all of them, right? And tearing them down and rebuilding them. And that requires a level of sacrifice, right? On so many people's parts to build a better future for all of us. But I think it's that when we come to the word sacrifice, right? Sacrificing some level of personal comfort to build a better collective future. I think that's where a lot of people get hung up, because we have this real focus on individual gain and individual comfort in this society. And so that tends to be that barrier to recreating that walkway, I think, in the way that would move all of us in a different direction.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult for a lot of parents, who want to protect their kids and fight for their own kids, to consider sending their kids to a more diverse school, and maybe, all of the ideas of what is a better school to attend. And you mentioned at the the NY Times podcast, Nice White Parents, and how challenging it was for them to kind of overhaul or try to change the school system, and the different how the minority families were not represented fully, or the interests were better served for. And I can understand for parents, they want to fight for the best for the parent, or for their kids, and for them to think about it would be a sacrifice, or in that way it could be really hard as well. Go ahead, Jane.
No, I just wanted to follow up on Misasha's comment and yours as well, Sarah, that I think that in these moments that are so difficult in society, I think it's really important to actually be hopeful of the future in terms of what can be. Because one of the points I heard at one of these talks on racism was that we have to remember that society created racism, so we can actually deconstruct it and introduce anti-racism to kind of deconstruct racism that has been here and ingrained in society for so long. So that gives me hope that we can deconstruct it and break it down and kind of make a better future for us as well as our kids. And one of the things for me, it's not just about the kids. I also think about my parents, because I'm a part of that sandwich generation that's really close to not only my kids, but also my parents. And I want to be in terms of what's left in terms of their years here on earth, to be good as well. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us, but we kind of have to take it with a lot of hope. And that's why I think your book is so good, because you provide tangible suggestions for anybody that reads the book to be able to, I think it was listen, act, and learn. So that was actually one of my questions was, how did you come up with those three foci for your particular book?
You know, it's interesting. So thank you for that. Yes, I think that's important for everyone to hear, because sometimes when we hear stuff like get loud, there's a portion of people who hear like, oh my gosh, I have to be angry. I have to like go deconstruct the prison system tomorrow. Like you can jump and then it feels impossible and they stop. And I think one of the things that we're saying is you can do all of this. Being anti-racist can be interrupting that random uncle at the holiday dinner table who's making a racist joke and saying, what did you mean by that? That is getting loud. That is interrupting. That is putting your foot down. And if you can if you start doing this work in your community, then other people get that vibe and start doing that to them. Like this community ripple effect by changing what you can in what you're already doing is not to be underestimated. And I think for our structure, we've been doing the podcast now for 3 years, and through the course of time, we've really found our voice, and we discovered that in our view, there's those 3 areas that need to be tapped into for us to feel like we can make long-lasting change. And so that first part, listen, is really just this idea of, you know what, maybe you don't have the opportunity to hear other people's perspectives. So let's listen to some stories. Let's interview people. Like let's use a TV, whatever it is that you need, because sometimes through sort of how our country came to be, right? Migration patterns, immigration patterns. Some people do live in communities where it is predominantly white. There's like 1 or 2 people, non-white families in that community. But so they may not have the relationships where they can hear different perspectives. And so we really felt like, much the same way when you all heard Misasha sharing her perspective at the beginning, you feel something, right? When you hear someone's story and they can become part of your why, it keeps you going through the difficult, challenging parts of this, right? When you know why, who you care about, people's stories, once you hear them, you can't unhear with your heart. So then you move on to learn, because education in this country is so, I mean, you're in education, like you're not taught evenly throughout the country. I think we uncovered the fact that slavery was mentioned like 3 times in one of the Southern states curriculum. And in Massachusetts, it was like over 100 times. And so students growing up in different education systems are learning very different truths about our country, facts, histories. And so we wanted to provide enough learning so people felt like they had that depth of knowledge to be able to speak up, because it feels weird, right? Something's right, but you're like, do I know enough? I mean, we're always on this journey learning more and more, but you want to have some baseline understanding of how we got to where we are as a country. And so we provide that second part in the book. But like Misasha said about, the anti-racist work, it is all about action. The only thing that can make change is by taking action and using your voice, noticing things different, putting your money to different resources. So that act part was really important for us to lean into. And we do that sometimes in the show and obviously in every chapter of this book as well, because I think that is what we need in order to really have people feel like, okay, I'm ready to start. Yeah. I have just enough. Let me start and I'll keep learning on this journey.
Yeah, I love on your podcast. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jackie.
I just love on your podcast how you bring in different experts and they all have their stories, and there's a personal quality to it that you can listen to them and then you can hear from their experiences and their perspective, and it hits, I think, a lot more deeply than these kind of distant academic kind of conversations, which is nice.
Yeah, and I think that I feel like it's a scaffolding too, the way that you set it up. Like if you listen and learn, you want to act. So I think that it's just a nice step for a lot of your readers as well. And I am particularly interested in also addressing the topic of white privilege, because it's a quite contentious topic. And because you're part white yourselves, being biracial, I just wanted to see if you can touch upon this idea of explaining white privilege and how you are able to use that own privilege in your own anti-racist work.
So I think, and you're absolutely right. I think white privilege is a term that people feel a way about from the moment you say it, and that could be in a whole host of ways, right? And I think when we use the term white privilege, we mean the fact that you've never been penalized in this country because of the color of your skin, right? And I think also it's really important, and this is kind of lost in our country these days, but that many things can be true at once, right? Multiple things can be true at once. So you can be white, you can benefit from white privilege, and have grown up poor, right? Both of those things can be true. You could benefit from white privilege in this country and have worked really hard throughout your entire life. I think that it tends to be when people hear white privilege, and they get angry about it, it's because they feel like it's canceling out some other part of their identity, right? Whether it's, class, or whether it's hard work, or whether, you pulled yourself up by your bootstraps in the version of the American dream that we've all been sold, right? All of those things can be true, but you still benefit in some ways in this country from being white, as doors are open to you in different ways, or your voice is heard in different ways. And I think for us, and all of that time that we've had spending or moving through white circles, right? We understand that our voice is heard differently, by different audiences. And that is how I think in particular we use that privilege, because because not everyone's voice is heard the same, and that is a really ugly truth in this country, right? But this message, we feel like this is one thing that we are absolutely going to use our voice, however we can, to continue to talk about this, to continue to get really uncomfortable, because there is sort of this understanding that we should all be really, or misunderstanding, I guess, that we should all be really comfortable talking about things we've never been comfortable talking about ever, right? And this is uncomfortable for everyone. Racism is not comfortable for anyone. When we were writing this book and we were trying to figure out the subtitle, my Black husband was like, racism is not comfortable for anyone to talk about. And he was like, you should definitely call it Let's Get Uncomfortable, not Let's Get Comfortable, Let's Get Uncomfortable. And he's right. I mean, no one feels all warm and fuzzy when we're like, let's talk about racism. But it's not about getting comfortable in it, right? It's about doing it. It's about talking about it. It's sometimes we do things that are hard. Sometimes we do things that are uncomfortable. If you have kids and you've ever talked to your kids about sex, let's say, that's not a comfortable conversation or an easy conversation. It's probably not also something you want to do one time and be like, great, we're done here. And it's definitely not something you want to just be like, hey, let's see what happens. I'm not going to talk to you about it, but you'll probably figure this out on your own someday, because TikTok or friends will give them a different view of it, probably something you want to control at home or share your values. And so I think that, yeah, it's a tough thing, but
just like the term, white privilege, that just the words alone make people uncomfortable. And was that also similar to the title of your book and your podcast, Dear White Women? There's a kind of a trend where, I don't want to say trend, but I don't know the better word is, where there's titles coming out of nice white parents, dear white people, dear white staffers, etc. That, the name of your book could, be uncomfortable for people to hear, where you're addressing them specifically, or what are the pros and cons, I guess, of having that title?
Yeah, the people have feelings about the title. That is no lie. We have heard everything from "you're racist for calling white people white," all the way to "wow, this is really edgy." And part of it is that, right? Like, it makes you uncomfortable. We're not trying to pull the wool over anybody's eyes. Like, this is an uncomfortable topic, and you're going into it knowing that there's something. It is also interesting to realize or hear about the assumptions people make about us, the people behind that title, because some people think we're Black, some people think we're going to be really nice, or we're white and we're really trying to be nice to white people. Like, people, I think, just by virtue of the title itself, it forces you to understand that we're all making assumptions, right? People, if you have a feeling or you're making assumptions about us, that's it right there. Like we
Yeah.
do that all the time as people. And so it's practice from the get-go when you enter the conversations.
And I think that just that discomfort is good, right? You need to feel that discomfort to actually pursue change for the better. So I think that making it uncomfortable is one of those situations where you're actually trying to understand and unpack what's going on to kind of maybe figure out the solution. But just for the sake of time, I see a ton of questions in the Q&A, and I want to make sure that we let people to get uncomfortable in talking about this conversation. So
Maybe
Jackie,
Megan, I don't know if there's any that you picked out.
Yeah, Jack
that
or
would
Megan,
be
do you want to pick some that are interesting?
putting it on
Yeah,
you.
well, they're all interesting, and I was trying to track them, but there are quite a few that have been coming out, and there are a few that we've kind of already answered. You all have had conversations around. One that jumped out at me when we were talking about the conversations with children, somebody, and I'm trying to find the exact wording, but essentially was asking what kind of on the other spectrum, like what about having conversations with the older generations in your life? How do you approach those, or do you have tips, or are they the same maybe as they would be with kids, or some variation of that? So how do we address this with older generations? We'll start with that.
It's such a good question. And I think it is different than speaking to our children about it. You know, Misasha pointed this out the other day on a call, and I was totally, my mind was blown because she said, well, my kids were born into a Black president and then had a white male president and then had an older white male president. But now we have a woman in the second highest office, right? Like, this is the children's generation. They have a totally different reality than the one that I was raised in, than the one that our parents were raised in, where it was white men all the way in leadership in this country, right? And so I think just knowing that, I think just starting even at that point, we can see how the conversations have to be different because the realities of our nation's leadership have been different. That said, you know, norms have changed. You know, people have grown of that generation. Some have grown up using words that are not appropriate, that are definitely hurtful and offensive. And we want to hold the line to teach and say like, oh, this is, you know, you don't use that word, we use Black people, or whatever the word is, you know. And I think it's important to hold the line and trust that people of the older generation can change. Because, for example, if you can't hold the line with, you know, older generations respecting certain things about how you talk about your grandkids, you know, Black friends, or for example, how can you respect gender differences? How can you trust that they're not going to body shame if you have, you know, kids with? And so I think it's just important to trust and challenge so that people can continue to grow based on all the research and all the things that we have learned since they were young themselves. You know, that said, sometimes it is hard. Sometimes it is like banging your head against a brick wall and people don't want to hear it. They don't want to be challenged. And I think you have to then take a breath, because if you're escalating and you're in a huge blow up fight, nobody is learning anything. You know, the world is not going to get better based on that fight for the Black neighbor down the street. And so if the purpose of it is to make change, you have to come back to it at a different time.
I think you're absolutely right in that it does take time. Like I remember some fairly contentious discussions that I had with my own parents around, in particular, George Floyd and riots, and it is a long process. I think it is, but sometimes, and I will say that most of my texts that I get from friends are about how to talk to their parents, actually, not necessarily how to talk to their kids. And I think a lot of it is related to patience in some ways, and sometimes I'll just send some information, and then we'll talk about it later, because they individually need time to process it, and they come at it with very different, you know, viewpoints. And my own white mother, you know, asked, why did we call the podcast Dear White Women? Because she felt a way about that, and couldn't believe we also called the book that. But since that point, we've had very different conversations. And so it is a gradual process, especially when you think about how far in history we have come, right? And that has not been a linear process for anyone.
think what's helpful for me, just because I have biracial kids as well, and just that connection between the generations, like actually having conversations with my mother-in-law who is white and connecting them to her grandchildren who are biracial and what their future looks like and what their experiences are like, because obviously they have a tender place in her heart. So having those conversations with her and connecting the generations has been really successful in our own family. But there are other questions. I saw one, was there another one that stood out to both of you? Or maybe even Sara and Misasha, I think you're able to see the questions if there was one in particular that kind of stood out.
Megan, I know you were unmuting before too. So in the meanwhile, if you've got anything, let us know.
Oh, I was just going to say there was another question that might build on where we were going is there was a question about resources or suggestions for educators. And since this is happening in a multicultural or multi-college arena, we have theoretically at least a lot of students and teachers in on this call. So there was a question about, what factors would you suggest educators taking into consideration as they plan curriculum to reduce the negative effects of things like cultural appropriation, stereotypes, and so forth, specifically within the educational system. So I was wondering if you wanted to add anything from our conversation that may be directed more specifically to education as a system.
The first thought that I had was, kids coming through the elementary school system. So I realize it's a little bit different, but I think continuing to ask that question, why, which is Misasha's favorite question. And if the answer is because it's always been like this, you really need to dig in, because things like that I've noticed even in the last few years that have shifted are crazy hair day, right? Like you have Spirit Week at schools. Well, people are like, why are we doing crazy hair day when hair is such a divided topic based on race? What if we did hats? What if we did socks? Why has it always been crazy hair day? And is there something we can deconstruct from that? And so I think asking ourselves, what audience might be affected by this that I'm not thinking about? And challenging those traditions, starting there with when it comes to celebrations or anything, I think is a great starting point. I mean, there's so many ways to look at it, because you can look at how our kids were taught about the history of Thanksgiving, or, how much were they diving into slavery, that people owned people. And I think there's a lot in there that we can all look at differently.
I think whose voices are being left out too is like a question that I've been thinking a lot about recently. I was just Sara and I we're working on an episode right now about critical race theory, what it is and what it isn't, as well as banned books and or book bans generally. And I think what books are being taught, because in my kids' elementary school there were a lot of books about white kids and a lot of books about animals that talk. Not a lot of books of kids of color just doing regular things. And so even in higher education, right, what are the texts that are being used, and whose voices are we centering, and why, I think, is also one of those questions too.
And then I just had one just kind of round out the conversation before we have our concluding remarks. Are there any recommendations in terms of your anti-racism bookshelf or podcast bookshelf, like that the audience members should definitely tune into to learn more?
Yeah, we can go back and forth. The first one that jumped out, Misasha, was Colin Seal and the oh my gosh, why am I blanking on it? But the idea of like thinking like a lawyer, and how we need to introduce more critical thinking to the curriculums of schools.
Yes, definitely that. The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee, if you haven't read that, definitely it explains why racism is really bad for all of us, and in ways that are especially for people who are sort of questioning some of the more empathetic ways. She sort of breaks it down in economic arguments as to why, in a very non-dry way, because I know I say that and everyone's eyes roll back in their head maybe and are like, that seems super boring. It's not, I promise you.
That's great. We only have 1 minute left, so we just...
Oh, okay. Should we wrap it up?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, well, thank you everyone for attending our WSP event, which was made possible by MiraCosta College's Foundation and the endorsements of Sierra College's Gender Equity Committee, MiraCosta College's Diversity, Equity, and Cultural Competence Committee, and MiraCosta College's Social Justice and Equity Center. Please don't forget to check out Sara and Misasha's podcast, Dear White Woman, and book by the same namesake, and also WSP's virtual gallery on this year's art exhibit, Women Anti-Racist, featuring artwork from around the globe. Today's the last day that'll be available for viewing online. And as part of Women's History Month, you can also go to our site, womensoaringproject.com. And we wish all of you a wonderful rest of the day and hope to see you next year at Women's History Month. And thank you, Misasha and Sara, for taking the time to talk to us. It was so informative. It was really, interesting. I could see all of the comments on the side, how excited everyone was.
Lots of gratitude in that chat box for the both of you. So thank you so much for your time and energy and just your insight and just your voices in general. So hopefully our paths will cross again.
I hope so. Thank you so much for having us. This was really a joy.